Hello, my name is Dr. Mike Toyn. I'm from the Institute of Education at the University of Cumbria. I'd like to just do a short presentation for you, which is about online learning, providing quality online learning. So to start with, what I'd like you to do is to consider a lesson or something that you've taught recently. When I say recently, I mean prior to lockdown. So what I'd like you to do is to hold that lesson in your mind and think about the different things that took place in that lesson, what it was about, activities that were planned for it, questions that you asked, all of those kinds of things, and just bear all of that in mind. So what I'm going to do now is make a prediction about that lesson. My prediction is that what didn't take place is that it took place in silence and that all of your learners read from a book. So why am I making this point? Well, I think that quality online learning isn't about learners sitting at a screen, at a laptop, at a computer, at a tablet and working through material on their own. That's not the kind of thing that you'd consider to be effective practice in a classroom or a lecture room, and it's certainly not the sort of thing that I would advocate that you consider as effective practice if you're doing online learning. So it doesn't really matter if you think about online learning as a recorded lecture, as it being something for your learners to read, or whether it's a video. Anything that's like that, where something is just the learner learning on their own, sitting at a screen, is one way. It's narrative, it's monologic, and there's no interaction with it within it. And so it's really positioning the learner as someone who is passive in the whole learning episode. They are a recipient of knowledge, and the expectation is that they will digest it and that they will subsequently have learnt it. And I think if you reflect back on the lesson that I asked you to consider at the start, you would have probably have had things where there would be information that you would have provided as the teacher. You would have probably asked questions to check learning. You might have had discussion between the learners taking place, and all of that will provide a rich and interactive learning environment. And the aim with online learning is to try to replicate that sort of environment in an online format. So if you want to classify types of learning, then one way of doing that is thinking about learning that takes place between the teacher and the learners, between the learners and between other learners, and then between learners and learning resources. So that's a sort of three-way classification that has arisen from the world of network learning, which is a way of explaining how learning takes place in online environments and how to provide environments that offer those three forms of interaction. And my belief is that quality online learning involves interaction in some form or another, and an understanding of those three forms of interaction. So that's between the teacher and learners, between learners and other learners, and between learners and learning resources. That it's the combination, the way that all of those three play together, that leads to quality online learning. So one of the things that's been quite interesting about the world of research within network learning is that quite often students and learners will substitute between different forms of interaction. So, for example, if there isn't, if the learning environment doesn't offer opportunities for learners to interact with other learners, then they will substitute in interactions with learning resources or with their teacher in order to fill that gap. And so it's about trying to find a sort of a suitable balance between all of the three of them. So how am I going to suggest that you could go about providing that balance? Well, I think it's about a question of actually just questioning your pedagogy in the same way that you would go about planning for teaching any lesson. You would begin by thinking, well, what is it that I want my learners to learn? And then how do I go about offering that learning to them? So how will they best learn that? So I think one of the things to get away from is the idea of where sort of in a culture of thinking about learning in blocks of time. Lessons tend to be an hour or 2 hours, and we tend to think about what we'll do within that. And I think one of the things for online learning is getting away from that, thinking about blocks of learning, and perhaps beginning to move to think about more sequences of learning. So how will the learning pan out, and what will it begin with, and what will it flow on to, and what will the different types of interaction play a part in within that sequence. So I would say that some important questions to ask yourself when planning for online learning is the first question is like for any lesson, for any learning activities, what is it that you want your learners to learn? So having identified what it is that you want them to learn, the next thing to think about is, well, how will they best learn that? If you're thinking about a classroom or a lecture room type environment, it will be thinking about the sort of things that will stimulate that learning and how they will go about that and the activities that they might do. If you're thinking about it in an online format, then it's thinking about how are they going to learn that, and using that framework of interactions is a really helpful starting point. So you can begin to think about, is the first thing that the learners are going to learn, is that going to be best achieved by them interacting with the tutor? Is it going to be best achieved by them interacting with their peers or with other learners, or is it going to be best done through an interaction with a resource? By breaking the learning down and thinking about the different stages, the different sequence, so beginning with one form of interaction and what will that look like, and then how will that be built on, and where will you offer opportunities to interact with yourself as the teacher, where will you build in opportunities to interact perhaps with other learners, building interactions to interact with learning resources. And by thinking about all of those and the role that all of those play and how they will be sequenced together, can then begin to offer a quality online learning experience. Another thing that I would encourage you to think about in relation to interactions is the distinction between a synchronous interaction and an asynchronous interaction. So if you take emails, so a study has recently been done that has said that a lot of teachers are providing online learning through, not through Zoom meetings, but through emails. So I think they're two fantastic examples of the points that I'm just talking about. So a Zoom meeting where one-to-one or one-to-many is an example of a synchronous interaction. Everyone's on at the same time and people can respond in more or less real time to questions and discussions. In contrast to that, an email is an asynchronous communication method. So it's where you send your email, you wait for a reply, someone can look at it in their own time, reply, and then comes back to you. And there's essentially gaps between all of the communications. So you're in a situation where the learning is not taking place in a synchronous way. And again, that's an important consideration to bear in mind when you're thinking about offering that interaction. Does the interaction actually need to take place there and then? And if it does, and if it's going to be best served by that, then setting up something like a video conference with Zoom or Skype or Teams or whatever other platform that you're using. If it doesn't, then perhaps something like a discussion board or a chat forum or an email exchange is the way to go. So I was interested when I read that survey of teachers that said that many of them were spending several hours a week in emailing their learners, because that said to me that actually it sounded to me like a lot of teachers are defaulting to a standard form of communication, of interaction with their students. And if that one form is dominating the learning experience, then perhaps it doesn't have, there is scope for a more varied approach to the interactions that those learners are experiencing. So I think as teachers, as educators, we all have a very good understanding of pedagogy. So being able to begin with that question of what is it that you want your learners to learn is a starting point that doesn't trouble us. We're also all able to kind of break that down and think about how is it that people will go about learning those things. And following from that, I think the next thing is I would encourage you to begin thinking about the sequence that learning takes place and building in that balance in a way which is structured and logical of interactions between learners and the teacher, between learners and other learners, and between learners and learning resources. So in essence, what I'm saying is that learning is not going to be best served if everything is done through a Zoom meeting, where you try to replicate a classroom or a lecture room lesson in an online format. Nor is you can spend as many hours as you like creating the most interactive narrated PowerPoint, which is full of animations and videos and links to this, that and the other, because that's a learning resource in effect, and that is only part of the picture. It's about thinking about building all of those things together in a way which builds all three forms of interaction into the learning experience. And the sequence of learning can be interesting, because it might be that you feel it's best to begin with some face-to-face teacher-to-learner interaction, perhaps by beginning with something like a Zoom meeting, where the teacher you will explain to your learners what the task is and what you hope it is that they will learn, and you clarify their understanding of that, and then you provide a resource or an activity in which they can sort of do some interaction between themselves and some interaction with some learning resources, which culminates in I don't know, say a written task or a submission of some form. Alternatively, it might be equally good that you adopt a sort of a flipped approach, where the task begins with some engagement with some learning resources. Subsequently, the learners have an opportunity to discuss that between themselves and clarify and test out some ideas before then coming into something like a Zoom meeting, where there is interaction with the tutor in which those ideas can be tested and explored, and the teacher has the opportunity to formatively assess the quality of the learning. So in summary, there's not really a set format for how all of these things will take place, but I think my key message is that you're looking for a balance of all of those forms of interaction within your online learning, and I think if you're able to do that, then you're going to be able to offer quality online learning which is stimulating and valuable and has a lasting impact on learners. Okay, thanks very much for listening. I hope that you found that helpful, and I hope that you enjoy putting it into practice and offering some really good online learning to your learners.